This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
Our first guest is Ron Self, the Director of Security at Little Rock School District. Ron, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I've been in this business for about 25 years now, and about the last 18 years in the school side and police officer before that, and happy to be a part of the ZeroNow community.
Great, thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. Our next guest is Kelly Martin, the Deputy Director of School Safety at Seminole County Sheriff's Office and the Seminole County Public Schools. Kelly, would you mind just introducing yourself and provide a little background as well?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. I've been with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office for the last 17 years. About 8 years ago, I was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant and Deputy Director of School Safety. So we've got a very unique collaboration with law enforcement and our school district in Seminole County. We have almost 70,000 students and about 8,000 employees that we're responsible for daily.
Well, we're glad that you could join us, Kelly. We'd love to learn more about what you're doing in your district as well. And Kelly Lamond is a former Assistant Superintendent of Safety and School Operations at Oxford Community Schools. Welcome, Jill.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I was part of the Oxford Schools family for more than 12 years. As Ara said, most recently, after the incident in November of 2021, we did unfortunately experience the worst. And so I carry that experience and that community and all of those lessons learned with me, and have committed my career now to helping to prevent school violence, particularly school shootings. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jill. We're glad you could join us because you have some, firsthand experience that I think you could share with the group and really diving into the whole essence of the team and ownership. So we're glad you could join us. Let's take a quick look at the poll results here. We had a poll here. Did it go away? Here we go. Was it launched? No, it wasn't. So, all right, we'll give you guys a second here to go ahead and vote on this poll. I thought we did launch it. So just take a second here. Who's responsible for implementing and operating your school safety programs? And we did this poll at the superintendents, the AASA organization did a poll recently with the attendees of the conference, and we'll be interesting to see what type of response we get here. And if you're not involved in a district, I know we do have some vendors on here too. Hold off there. All right, let's see what we have here. Okay, and the poll. All right, let's take a look here. Okay, that's interesting. So most schools that are participating here have a school safety director. Ron, are you surprised at the results?
Not necessarily surprised at the results, surprised that many people have a school safety director a little bit. Like I said, we've seen that increase significantly over the last few years, and hopefully we'll continue to see that increase. But and I think that the question could be just a little bit misleading, because in the reality, the superintendent's responsible for everything, right? So it always goes back to the superintendent. But I think that's whoever is the in between that handles that. So good to see that many of them have a school safety director.
That is, yeah, I'm actually quite surprised too. I mean, yeah, obviously the buck stops at the superintendent, but the safety director is the actual operationalized role. Kelly, I mean, what is your district set up in Seminole County? Do you have directors at every school? How does that organizational structure look like from a safety team perspective?
Sure. So we have one overall school safety and security director for the district, and then we have point people at each of our schools. For us, we use our school resource officer or deputy at the school as kind of our subject matter expert for school safety and security. And then we also have them work, obviously, in collaboration with the principal or the designated person on their campus to make sure that our message that we're crafting from our office is getting out to all of the schools.
Yeah, and Jill, at your district, I mean, who was part of the safety team at your district, or did you have a team? How was that structured at Oxford?
Yep. So after the incident, we had already had a robust safety team, but then we were told after the incident maybe to include more parent voice. And so we did include an entire parent section onto the school safety committee, and made it that people had to actually apply to do that. And we interviewed for those positions to make sure that they were, oftentimes with volunteer positions, you get people that come and go. We wanted to make sure we had people who were committed and had the ability in terms of time available to actually commit to the district. And we had some excellent parents involved in that.
That's great. And Ron, in your district, I mean, what does your safety team or what do the teams look like in your district, and how is that structured?
It's mostly held by it's an interesting point on the parents. So we've used parents for various other things, but maybe not as well as maybe we should on the safety part. So I think that that's a great point that I'm going to take back, is that, because we get their input when we're looking at various different things, but not necessarily on the team as a whole. But, it's handled as a district. And then, we talked briefly earlier about the state of Arkansas now requires a safety coordinator on each campus. So those become part of that team as well. So you're constantly communicating out with those folks as well. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic.
And John, Ron, let's talk about the safety coordinator role. Are there any specific requirements for a safety coordinator, or is it something that's added to a staff's existing portfolio of responsibilities?
Well, and I guess I need to probably explain that just a little bit better. So it's a school safety coordinator is required at each campus. Now that doesn't mean that they handle the overall safety and security of the district. That still lies within our district team. Now that could vary from district to district, of course, depending on size. But as of right now, there is no requirement, except for you have to go through a 2-day course. There's a basic safety coordinator academy, and then there's an advanced safety coordinator academy, and then you have to go through those 16 hours of training. It's taught by I'm one of the instructors of it, so it's taught by folks that are kind of been in it and been around, but it's all other duties as assigned. If that makes sense.
And Kelly, I think you had some thoughts on that too.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to mention that. So similarly, as well as having our large overall district team that's responsible, each of our schools have their own either emergency response or safety team. They get together. They're actually required to meet monthly. They keep meeting notes. They go over different trainings and things like that. And that's just looking at that individual campus and making sure that they're addressing any safety and security needs for that campus. And then that gets reported back up to our office.
And who in Seminole County, who is participating in on the safety teams that you just mentioned?
So we make sure that they're multidisciplinary. We want to make sure that we have a school administrator, a teacher, and then the school resource officer, a deputy, as well as, they have other members of the school staff that participate. And like I said, they meet monthly and address any needs, and then they perform staff trainings with the entire campus staff related to school safety and security needs that they've identified as needing to discuss further.
And on that note, Jill, at your school, was there a dedicated safety and security director for the school or for the district in general?
So prior to the incident, there was not. Post-incident, I actually was that individual. And then about 9 months after the incident, I had left, and there are 2 individuals that have taken that role. But I think, what's really important is having those relationships with law enforcement and making sure that the local law enforcement, to Kelly's point, is included in the conversation as well, and having strong relationships where they're regularly in the school and not only seen during a threat type incident, but also in very positive settings as well to build relationships with students and staff.
Well, Ron, what role does an SRO play? Because I know I've spoken to a number of superintendents in the past months that point to the SRO as their director of safety and security for the school. Is that an accurate representation?
I think that there's varying ways. So Kelly has probably one of the most interesting concepts going on there that I've ever seen. The SROs for us are not a part of that. We do talk with them, we do meet with them, we do involve them, but they are strictly a contracted entity on our campuses. So we have an MOU, just like everyone should, because that's probably the most important part of your SRO program. And we do involve them on most of our safety stuff, and a lot of our various programs that we implement, they are heavily involved, but they don't run the program, if that makes sense. That deal that Kelly has just keeps intriguing me more and more.
I'm intrigued by it too, Kelly. Why don't you tell us what the program is all about?
Yeah, so the nice thing, obviously, because, I'm in law enforcement, part of the sheriff's office, we have, a little bit easier contact and leverage with our school resource officers and deputies. So we want to make sure that not only are they, that person on campus that's going to, take down an active assailant or whatever the case may be, but they're there building relationships, but also that subject matter expert that principals can turn to for school safety needs. When principals who probably started off as teachers in most cases, when they got into their job, I don't think that emergency manager or school safety director was really kind of part of what they initially started thinking about as being part of their job tasks. So we kind of want to take a little bit of that pressure off of them when it comes to that and give that to the person that we've, completely trained, while still giving the principal the tools to make those decisions where they need to in matters that are related to the education background. So.
And what did the process of implementing that look like? I mean, how long have you been operating that type of model?
Yep. So it's been about 8 years. We had at the time the superintendent and the sheriff that was there. We had already had school resource officers in most of our campuses. And this was actually before. I don't think I mentioned this yet, and I apologize, but I'm in Florida. So this was before the Parkland shooting. We actually started to make sure that we had an officer or deputy at every single school campus. And that was when our office, as it stands now, was created within the school district, where it's run completely by law enforcement. So we were lucky enough to have, 2 forward-thinking leaders at both the sheriff's office and the school district to put this program in place. And it did take some time. At the start of it, the principal was, always looked at as kind of the king of their kingdom when it comes to their school, and they still very much are in a lot of ways. But when it comes to matters of school safety and security, it's deferred to our team. And like I said, we use our school resource officers and deputies, as well as, some of our point people on campus to make sure that they're getting that message out and still continuing to be kind of that champion of what school safety and security means and how important it is.
Joe, you mentioned earlier about involving parents in the school safety team. What role do students have, or do they have a role in having a voice in regards to school safety?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was honored to be in a district this morning, actually, and met some of the students who engage in that district's school safety planning. And while it's probably not appropriate, from an age perspective for them to be involved in all aspects of safety planning, they can be our greatest resource. They know one another, they have the pulse of the building, they typically have the most information. And still today, the majority of violent incidents that are averted, we see in the 2019 U.S. Secret Service report, is from having an adult relationship, child to adult. So how do we make sure that we're getting that information from kids and explaining to them the avenues that we've created? Sometimes we put things in place for kids that aren't necessarily best for kids. Like, why don't we listen to them and ask their opinion and get their voice involved in safety planning? And I think it's really important. And there are some districts who are doing that in a very, very cool way, creative way. And I think that that's something we should all be looking to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yep, I completely agree with that, Jill. One of the things that we've found very successful is when we're trying to develop a new campaign or get a new message out, is involving kids in that message, because me standing up there on the video and talking to the kids or doing it in person isn't going to get that involvement and get that buy-in from the kids like it does if they're hearing it from their peers.
No doubt. And Ron, in your district, do you involve students and parents as well? And is that unique to Jill's former district?
No, I don't think it's necessarily unique. We utilize kids a lot, various different safety things. Like for graduation, for example, when we're trying to get across our safety and security procedures, we utilize the students to get that information out, and we utilize them as actors as well. So I don't think it's odd. I had visited with a much smaller district here just a few months ago, and they had a camera viewing room, and they were utilizing students to help watch the cameras. Now, they were very selective in what students they used, and they were high school students, but they were involving them in that process to show them how they're trying to keep the school safe. And while I was there, I was able to talk with the kids, and the kids were pointing out things that maybe we didn't see as adults, and it was a really good program. So I think that when you start utilizing those students, you start thinking outside the box in various different ways, and I think you're going to excel, just by using students. So.
Yep. And, one group that we haven't really touched on that I think sometimes gets overlooked is the actual classroom teacher. I do think that there should be at least 1 or 2 classroom teachers involved, maybe rotating, maybe from different departments, but to get that teacher view, because they really see things in a very different way than administrators do, than building administrators, than district administrators. And so including that layer, I think, in the safety planning is really important as well.
So, we're talking about teams and all the folks that are participating in the teams. That, I guess the question is, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Ron, is, the ownership. Can there be ownership amongst 5 or 6 people on a team? Like you take this, Ron, Kelly's got that, Jill's got this, or do you need to have that person who is the center of accountability?
Yeah, so I think that it's very important to have that person. You've got to have that one person that's going to take that ownership of it. It's great to have the team, and it's great to have more than one conversation, and you should involve a team. You should involve everyone on your campuses, right? So let's don't forget about our support staff, because your maintenance and custodial folks know more than anybody in the school probably. So you've got to involve all those folks, but you've got to have someone who handles it from the top. So that's why there's got to be that push for school districts. And I think that there is. I think it's slower than what we would like to see it, but there's got to be that push for school districts to hire a safety director or security director. I noticed that one of the questions over here was about safety being 2 different things, right? So you got the school safety part, or you've got the slips, trips, and falls. So within our district, it actually falls all under me. So we handle the risk management side of it, which is the workers' compensation part of it, plus the overall the physical security part of it. So I think that that's a good point and a good question.
So Ron said Arkansas requires a security coordinator. Does Florida require a coordinator for schools in Florida, Kelly?
Yeah, so significant legislation was passed after the shooting at Parkland, and each school district is actually required to name to the Department of Education a school safety specialist for that district, and they're the one that ultimately ends up being responsible for all of the school safety compliance that DOE will come in and randomly check. They'll go to visit schools and things like that and ensure that things are being done the way that both the law and DOE rule says. So we do have one in every district.
That's great. And are there specific requirements or standards that this coordinator position does require to possess?
Yes, there are some minimum requirements that is statutory. Some of it includes some of the ICS type classes that they have to take, as well as being certified every year. Right now, that certification is actually done through DOE. We do a summer conference every year. But recently, within the last 2 years, and I'm actually part of the organization, it's called the Florida School Safety Specialists Association. We're actually working on kind of getting that a little bit more organized as far as a more formal certification process for school safety specialists.
And Jill, let's go back to your district and things that you learned, obviously, because you mentioned before there was not a safety director. After the incident, there was a safety director. What would you say the biggest takeaway from that experiences that you could share with our participants?
Sure. And obviously with ongoing trials and things like that, it's a very sensitive topic. But what I can share is that, multiple different individuals own pieces and parts of school safety before the incident. And I think it was important that one individual post-incident, and clearly that was the case, take over all of those responsibilities, to Ron's earlier point, and have really one point of contact for all safety measures. Sometimes safety means facilities. Sometimes safety means mental health. Sometimes safety means, what does safety mean? And having one person that sort of oversees all of those departments and all of those different projects is really important. And I think that is something we learned from the tragedy.
Thanks, Jill. I know that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot to share with the group, and that's what we're hoping to learn from that. And we're constantly learning, constantly refining things. Like Ron said, what, even 10 years ago, there were very few safety directors, security directors in school districts, and we're starting to see a little bit of more of that happening right now, because it does come to ownership.
Yeah,
Ron.
and I'll comment on that just real quick, because I started my first school security director job 18 years ago after being in law enforcement and an SRO. So spending that time in there. And when I started in Arkansas, there was probably literally 3 of us. I had no clue what to do, to be honest with you. I came out of law enforcement and went straight into the school world. Those are 2 totally different worlds. A lot of people think that they are very the same. They are not. They're very different. And I had a lot to learn. And so we wrote a program from the bottom up. Luckily, it was a smaller district. And then I came over to Little Rock. So, and now we're seeing that grow. The problem that we're running into a lot of times, though, is still the statistics show us that the average public school district enrollment is 3,600 students. So Florida as a state is a very much an exception to that, right? So a lot of large districts in Florida, but on the national average, the public school district enrollment is 3,600 students. So you start dropping down into those below 2,000, below 1,500 students, schools, it's difficult for them to say, hey, we're going to hire a position and pay them directly to be a school safety director or school security director. So then that's where, you start forming those partnerships with law enforcement. So, while we are seeing it, that's still going to be an issue, right? We've got to get there, but at least at the very minimal, call Kelly and see about getting a good partnership with your law enforcement agency and getting them involved, so that they can help you with that security side.
And I think that's a
Kelly.
very important point, Ron, too, when it comes to, having those relationships with law enforcement. They have to happen before you have an incident. You can't wait until, the worst case scenario happens and then start having those conversations, because that collaboration is just not going to be there. That was very much why we actually ended up at the school district the way that we did, is that there was an incident that occurred. The superintendent was very proactive and obviously very involved with the sheriff, but there was a lot of things that, he admitted when it came to school safety that it wasn't his wheelhouse. So he wanted to make sure that, the district's interests were, being looked at and considered when it came from law enforcement response as well. And having that kind of pre-established as we go into any incident now has been significantly impactful to the district.
Yeah, and to your point, Kelly, I couldn't agree more to have those relationships before an incident. Thank goodness that we did have those strong relationships. The local county sheriff from the village police, they knew our building, they were familiar with entryways, they were familiar with our safety and security practices, they had done drills with us, and really helped us to be prepared in how to respond that day. It's unfortunate that we ever had to respond. That's a different conversation, right? But they did know the building. We had the door numbers. That's just something small. If anybody can do something today when you go home to your district, to have door numbers on the inside, interior, and the exterior of the building that match one another, so that someone who's inside can speak to a first responder outside and talk the same language. What a small thing that certainly impacted the response on the day of our tragedy. There are a lot of little, I think that's the whole point of ZeroNow. There are many steps that we can take and so many little things we can do that add up in a big way. And one of those, maybe the most important, are those relationships with law enforcement.
Well, you mentioned the purpose of ZeroNow, and like Ron mentioned, and Chief Dussault mentioned that at the beginning of the video, we're constantly learning. We don't know everything yet, and collectively put our minds together. Let's learn from one another, and that's such a critical thing, especially when it comes to that safety director role and operationalizing school safety. What can we learn from one another and share best practices? Ron, I'm sorry, I keep going back to this. So go, because I know of a lot of districts that the PE teacher is also the safety coordinator for the school. I mean, is there any sort of background that a staff member should have if they're going to be assigned the safety coordinator designation?
So first of all, let me jump back to one thing Jill just said, and she mentioned the door numbering, and so it's the what FEMA and what the government's recommending right now is the door numbering outside, inside, and even at the bottom of the door for fire evacuations. But there's actually grant money out there for that. So go find it. Don't say we don't have the funding for it. I just got $100,000 grant to do that project, and we're dead in the middle of it. So don't say there's not funding out there, because there is. So there is grant money out there for that. Back to what you're saying. I think, in my opinion, now I have had this discussion with some people just as of recently, that it should be someone with a little bit of a security or law enforcement background. Or emergency management, just to get that back piece. Because there's a lot of that ICS, and that when you start getting into, and Kelly mentioned the incident command and various other things a while ago. So when you start getting into that, so Little Rock, we have a full-time emergency management coordinator that works on my staff. So when you start getting into those larger districts, you've got to have someone with that background and that does that. Now, with that being said, I've had my mind changed just slightly recently, because there were some good points made about some former educators that took over this role and that didn't have that background. but were willing to learn. And I think that that is the biggest point of it, is you can utilize those folks, but they must be open to learning a different world, because there's some things that you're going to have to change your mindset on. Now, if you've got a Kelly, or if you've got a Jill, or whoever that has some of that background, then I think that's where you need to go. But at minimal, I think using someone on the education side that's willing to learn is better than not having one at all, if that makes sense to you.
And are there training resources that are available? Kelly, I'll direct this to you, for a teacher, right? Or a staff member at a school district that does not have a background in law enforcement or first responder or any sort of emergency management, to learn those skills if the school does not have a budget for it. And we'll talk about that in a second, Ron. You mentioned that. But is there, I mean, what would you recommend?
Sure. I mean, we use a lot of our own internally created content for things like that. But I would say probably one of the best starting points for something like that is the FEMA website. All those classes are free. It gets into incident command and kind of goes and delves into how that collaboration with all the different stakeholders at an event would work. So it would kind of be that like primary level of, looking into what incident command structure is and how it operates for larger incidents. And there are also several other school safety websites through the federal level that offers a lot of great free resources.
Can I ask Kelly, just because of your background, I'm going to ask the flip side of that. So for SROs and for those individuals who are in law enforcement who are really passionate about helping the school setting, but maybe to Ron's earlier point, have never worked in a school or are not familiar with the nuances of dealing with children in particular, do you have resources to point folks to help with that relationship between SRO and the school folks on the other end?
Yeah, I know one of the things that we've done, because obviously we're always recruiting for school resource officers also within our own department. We actually have our supervisors go and attend shift briefings with patrol to kind of give them some information. And then also during our training program, as they get hired on, we have them as part of their field training come for a day, work in a school so that they can kind of get and understand, because it is a very different side of law enforcement that I don't think a lot of people really realize or recognize when they first, heard the term like kitty cop and things like that. And they think, it's all about just high-fiving, and that's a great part of their job, but there is so much more that they're involved with and do on their school campuses. So we try to really highlight that. And they also do have, like in Florida, and I'm sure in many other states, FDLE has a school resource officer course. It's a week-long 40-hour course that they can go and take and become, more familiar with that role and how that looks for us. So.
Yeah, and then in Arkansas, we actually have some formal classes that they could take that go, and we encourage the SRO and the administrator to take them together so that they go at the same time to take the class together. So it's a SRO roles and responsibilities in schools, because there is some varying different laws and how things work and how that relationship. But I think the biggest point that should be taken from all of this is to build a relationship. Don't go to work from 9 to 5 and the SRO goes to their office and the administrator goes to their office and they never speak to each other unless an incident occurs. They should be involved. The SRO should be deeply involved. They should be attending staff meetings. They should be a part of your culture. So it's all about that culture, right? So everybody always wants to jump towards the pretty shiny things, right? So they come in with a vendor with this pretty shiny things. And don't get me wrong, we have pretty shiny things here, but we laid some groundwork first. And when you lay that groundwork and you build that culture and you foster those relationships, that's when you're going to start succeeding. So it doesn't necessarily have to be any kind of formal training. It could be an SRO going to an administrator going, hey, why did you do that? And the administrator going, hey, let me tell you about this law that deals with special needs students and why we can't treat them like other students. So it's those conversations. And I think that's the biggest point.
And guess what? Culture is free, right? How much does that, what does that cost? I mean, creating a culture of safety. And going back to the funny, one of the things that we the metaphor that we typically use with ZeroNow is that school safety is a journey, right? You just don't, you're not there. You're not just a safe school overnight. And part of that journey is having a roadmap, a path forward, right? And part of that path is starting, we're having this conversation now, starting with a safety team, right? And any team, if you're going on a journey, you need someone who has been there before, that has like your Sherpa, the guide, right, to take you through that. And wouldn't it be great to have a dedicated person that knows safety and security on a broad, holistic approach that can guide the district down that journey to safer schools? And we talk about shiny things and vendors and technology and everything else. But before you even get to that point, understanding where your vulnerabilities are. So where are the gaps of security vulnerabilities in your district, right? And so you have your safety team, you have your leader of that safety team, an experienced Ron Sell, for example, that can lead that district through understand your vulnerabilities. Then guess what? Now there's funding that's available based on filling those gaps versus, hey, we need this technology. There's funding available for this particular product, but understanding where does that fit in to the overall picture of things along that journey. So I'll get off my soapbox now. Okay, let's take a couple questions here. And Mike Garcia, I saw you ask a question there. Hey, Mike. So we talked about students, parents, and teachers. What about nurses, right? Where do nurses play into the whole safety team? Ron, I think you have an idea.
Oh, they play a huge integral part of that. And I think that, we create response teams on campus, on the individual campuses, and those response teams respond to an incident, whether so if a classroom calls for assistance, so you've got a response team that goes, and typically that consists of medical personnel, and then it consists, a big part of that is the mental side of it, right? So, because if you've got students in crisis, we need someone there that can handle that part of it. And then security and law enforcement. But stop the bleed. We do our nursing. Our nursing division at our school is great. They're second to none. I might be a little bit of partial there, but and we bring them in multiple times a year to do stop the bleed training, because we found that here's what we found with folks out there that don't apply a tourniquet every day. When it comes time to apply a tourniquet, they probably won't apply it because they're scared to death to apply a tourniquet. But if you constantly give them more training, and it goes back to that muscle memory type stuff, and you constantly give them more training, then they're more apt to do that. And those nurses are a huge part of that, because they're going to be the ones that help us respond. And a lot of the situations that we respond to on a daily basis can be handled by a mental side or your nursing side. So that's a huge resource. Great point. They also mentioned transportation directors and buses. That's another great point. I think it's an all around approach that you have to involve here.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It was about transportation. Our transportation director was absolutely integral in helping, making sure that they knew where the relocation site is, reunification site, and making sure that they understand the safety and security, but also helping us to plan and saying, that this thing won't work, or this idea is great, but it's not going to work. We don't have enough buses for that, or, what have you. Same thing with custodial, not necessarily being a part every single time of the team, but understanding the facilities and depending on those roles within your district. I'm very jealous that you guys had a school nurse. In Michigan, that's sort of something that we've done away with. And so that's a resource that I hadn't even considered. I would love to have a school nurse as part of the school safety team, but that's very uncommon here. So
we have one on every campus.
That's amazing. That's an amazing resource.
That was always the ticket home early, the school nurse. I just want to remind our participants, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A field. A question came in, I think Jose Figueroa asked this, and this is very important. So a couple things. Number one, it's a two-part question. I'll get Jose's part second. Is it possible to have, this one position that has that big, broad worldview that understands and can coordinate with behavioral threat assessments and physical security, safety, transportation, stop the bleed, all these things? Is this a unicorn run, or is this an actual position? Is it possible for a director to have that broad background?
No, it exists. I mean, I'm sitting right here in front of you, so I don't have a horn sticking off my head.
I was going to say, that's right.
we exist. It's just I think it's rare. I don't think that it's you got a lot of folks that claim they're experts nowadays. I hate that. I don't like that word at all. But it's about learning too, right? So how can I learn what Kelly's doing, right? So I've mentioned her program 3 or 4 times just because I want to learn more about that side. So I have a law enforcement background. I have security. I have been in school security. I also hold a superintendent's license in 2 states, and I've never taught in a class just because I wanted to learn the education side to better, to further my knowledge. So I think that it's all about the person that you have in there and how we can learn both worlds and how they can create partnerships and how we move that forward. So I think it does exist. You just got to find them.
Yep, I 100% agree with you, Ron. And the other big thing, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, learning, but two is knowing yourself, like as you're, if you're in that seat as a director, is knowing what you don't know and then finding those people that can help fill those gaps for you and bringing the right people to the table so that they can fill those parts where you're lacking.
She stole one of my favorite sayings is a lot of schools don't know what they don't know. And that's I can almost put a period on it right there.
Exactly, Ron. Yeah, and the folks that are participating in these programs have probably heard me say that a couple hundred times as well. But yeah, you don't know what you don't know, and that's part that is a part of the core issue, I think, with that journey to safe schools, because you start from one point and you just don't know what's ahead of you in the forest ahead. But that's why, as you're traveling down this journey to safer schools and following this path, having a community that can share their experiences with one another. Hey, we tried this out in our district. This is what we did in Seminole County. This is what we did. Share those experiences so we can all improve. And I don't know what was the video, but one of the things that Bruce Cannell, our vice president at ZeroNow, he's with Genentech, always says, all of our heads together are much more effective than just one alone. So that's critical. So Jose, I'm going to go back and ask your question this time. Last time I worked around it. So Ron, okay, so who does Ron report to? Do you report to superintendent? Are you on a parallel path with a lateral path with facilities and IT? I mean, who should the security director report to?
Well, and I think you're going to see that change varying from state to state. For example, Texas is required to report to the superintendent. I personally think that that's probably the best idea. I do not. I report to the chief deputy, which is directly underneath the superintendent. But it really, all that is a line, because I have direct communication with the superintendent on a daily basis. So your security and safety director has to have communication with that superintendent, right? You can't say, well, you got to go here and you got to go there. You have to be able to have a direct communication. And personally, I think that it should have that direct communication. It works for us. Our chief deputy is great. It's really not that big of a deal here, and it's just the way it's set up. But in a perfect world, it should report directly to a superintendent, in my opinion.
Joe.
Yeah, and Ron, I want to jump in. You had said, in a perfect world, right, they might report to the superintendent, but in those instances where they don't, I think it's just important that the superintendent, the highest level of leadership, is involved in making sure there's funding available for those resources and for those programs, and making sure that the district strategic plan aligns with those programs and all of those things. So I think that, making sure they're part of the conversation is the best way to do that, but then making sure that they're also making it a priority in the district is number one.
Kelly, I think you had a thought on that too.
Oh, yes. No, I was just going to agree. That's what we do here as well in Seminole, is that it's a direct report to the superintendent, which, again, I echo as being super important, because then that message doesn't get diluted or watered down as it goes back up. And, you can kind of ensure that you're getting that full conversation and making sure that everybody's got the information that they need to make all the decisions that, ultimately the superintendent ends up having to make. So.
Ron, in your district, I mean, how do you work with principals? What type of relationship do you have with principals in the different schools in the district?
Principals, it's I always say that we're kind of like the state, and the principals are the cities. So, they're going to have ownership in their building, but and I'll tie this back into where that safety and security director has, you have to be able to have the authority to come in and command over that building if needed. So you can't have that person that other duties as assigned. And I know we've mentioned this more than once, that when they go into a school because there's an incident and they try to take command of that school and the principal doesn't allow them, more than likely because you hadn't built that relationship already, but two, because you don't have the authority. So the principals are huge, right? So we're going into their world. So we're going to make sure that they're happy and make sure everything's going on. I always tell folks that if you wanted me to get if you wanted to get rid of me quick, take all the cameras down, right? Because people say, well, you don't need cameras, you don't need this, you don't need that. Well, principals, that's their world. So that's what we do to make them happy. And so anytime we implement a new product, we typically send it down for a test program on a campus to get principals' feedback, right? Because they're the one that's got to deal with it every day. I can dream up everything in the world, but if I send it out and the schools and the principals don't have buy-in, the staff doesn't have buy-in, I just wasted whatever millions of dollars I just spent. So I think it's very important to keep them on board.
Absolutely. I know one of our ZeroNow members, who's a safety director, he holds weekly Zoom meetings with all the principals, just a safety, 30-45 minute Zoom meeting. Hey, let's talk about safety issues that you might have in your school. Let's get that. But it's about building a culture of safety and feeling where students feel safe talking to a teacher, a guidance counselor, safety director, SRO, about some concerns they may have. Someone might be threatening to harm themselves or harm another person or other people. And so it's important to have that open communication. Jill.
Yeah, I also want to mention another function of a school safety team. We're talking a lot about planning and emergency planning, but you mentioned all shiny things and vendors. What was really dehumanizing was about not even 3 hours post first gunshot. So the first gunshot was at 12:51. By about 3 o'clock, my phone was blowing up, and it's from safety vendors and security vendors. And it's because they know that post incident, when you've had a mass casualty incident, you're going to receive a certain amount of funding. And they knew that. I didn't know that. I was still, actively locked down in the high school, and my phone's going off of people trying to sell you things. If only you'd had our lock, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. We don't even know what's happened yet, right? But they're sure that their product is best. I really think a function of that safety team is to review these different safety and security products. There are so many bad actors in the space. It is outrageous. It is so outrageous to see how many people came to us and sell to us.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Jill. And once again, we appreciate you sharing your experience. And I know it takes a lot coming on and sharing this with everybody. But that goes back to the whole path to safer schools. Before you buy any technology or vendor or shiny objects, how do you know where that fits in? Where having that vulnerability assessment, understanding where the gaps are, and then fill those gaps with the technology versus listening to the latest sales pitch. Oh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. We'll buy that, throw that in here. It needs to fit together like a piece of the puzzle, and the technology needs to work. It needs to be interoperable with other technologies that you already have or intend on purchasing. So that's why it's so important before, and that's a reactive approach. Obviously trying to reach out after an incident versus being proactive. Having that leadership, the ownership, understanding where your gaps are, then seeking funding, which will then fund your technology, your training programs, etc. Ron, I guarantee you a thought on this one.
I think you hit it very well when you said the assessments, and you have to be able to do those assessments. And here's the deal, and I think it's Florida that requires an outside organization to come in and do their assessments. I'm sure Kelly can speak to that in a minute, but don't necessarily do the assessment with someone. So if you do it as an in-house, so utilize someone from the A school to go do an assessment with you at B school, so that you have someone. I always say, when I find out where the biggest problems are, and not necessarily security, but operational wise, it's when I get a new principal, right? Because the principal that's been there for 10 years walked past that door that needed to be fixed 30 times and never realized it needed to be fixed. So you bring in someone that doesn't see that on the everyday. And then the next thing has to be that just because it works for Ron Self at Little Rock School District doesn't mean it works for everyone, right? So that product that I may have, you may be nowhere near ready for that product. You may have a lot more work to do before you get to that product. So don't think that, and that's the biggest trap that schools fall into, and they wind up spending loads of money on wasted items that will never be used because they don't know where to begin. And I think you've said it about probably 50 times during this thing, is reach out to those who you can talk to, right? So it's not almost a day that goes by that I don't call someone or someone doesn't call me saying, hey, what do you know about this? What are you doing with this? So you have to create that circle of people that you can reach out to. And I think that's important.
Exactly, Ron. And Jill, so obviously it's a natural response to just do something. Okay, we're gonna buy this, we're going to buy that, we're going to put new locks on the doors and this and that, because you are in a reactive posture. And so, taking that proactive approach is absolutely critical. And that's, obviously you want to make decisions based on where it all fits. And I'll say it one more time, because we do have a number of vendors around this. We have obviously a lot of safety directors, administrators, but interoperability is so critical, because the whole idea is that when there is a threat detected, can you automate the entire response within seconds, milliseconds? So notifications, locking doors, notifying people, notifying law enforcement, whatever those things are, happen instantly, but understanding where that all fits in. So yes, Jill, to your point, yes, a safety and security director needs to understand the technology that exists there, because technology are tools. They're tools of Ron's trade or Kelly's trade. They're tools of the trade. So it's critical. Kelly, I'm going to direct this question for you. We have about 10 more minutes left. We have some questions. So Martin asked a question. So this is interesting, because this comes up a lot, like especially in rural school districts. Martin mentions that he's a retired officer and teacher. What about the small schools that don't have the resources to have people to build a safety team or a director? What about the thousands of schools that just don't have the resources?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely goes back to where we're talking about, a culture of school safety awareness and just doing the simple things. I mean, we preach all the time that one of the biggest things that we can do to try to, as far as cheap school safety and security, is just locking doors. We require that all of our doors be locked during instructional time. The school buildings on the outside have to be, locked. We use a single point of entry, which is the front lobby outside of arrival and dismissal times. During arrival and dismissal, there has to be a staff member there at a door, making sure that the people that are coming onto campus are supposed to be there. None of that costs money. So, doing your reading, doing your research, and just really championing that overall culture and mindset of what it takes to be, a safe school. If you see something, say something. Having some sort of reporting system, especially anonymously, for students to be able to report their concerns, or developing that rapport with their school administrators, their teachers, their school resource officers, so that they feel comfortable coming and talking to somebody. None of that costs any money. And those are some of the most important school safety and security, tools that we have available to us.
Right, it's part of a multi-layered approach,
Yep.
right? And something you mentioned and it's a cultural thing. I mean, it's rude to not hold the door open for someone behind you. And that's a common thing. I always tell my daughter, she's in college, but when she goes to her apartment, there's, they have access control, the door lock. Like, it's not being rude, saying, like, listen, I don't know you. I'm gonna, you need your key to get in. But it's a cultural thing. What do you think, Ron?
Yeah.
Taking ownership, and I think that's the biggest part too. And then to Kelly's point with the locks, so go one further, work with your legislators and make it law. Get law passed. So Arkansas just recently passed that all doors to all schools have to be locked at all times, external doors. We're now working to where all internal doors have to be passed. So what we did is, while waiting on the wonderful wheels of government to move fast, we went to the board and got a policy passed to where it gives those principals and it gives those in charge something with teeth to say, hey, you're not closing your door, you're not locking your door. And so you go one further and get that done. And then, and it goes back to that communication piece and how do we do this, right? Because when you tell a teacher, you got to keep your door locked all day long, it's a little bit of a change, right? And it's different. And so we got to work with them and try to figure out how we get past things. So great point, Kelly.
Jill, I'm going to direct this one to you. This is from Michael Dingle. So, and we were chatting about this a little bit earlier, but don't put security as another duty as assigned under facilities, IT, superintendent. Whatever. I mean, is it that much of a challenge to not have clear ownership, that sole role that is like a cabinet level position that reports to the superintendent?
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about that earlier, right? Making sure there's a clear delineation of roles. It's in your job responsibilities. It's something that everyone on cabinet understands together, and that the district knows really the chain of command for decision making when it comes to safety and security. And like what we talked about earlier, making sure that superintendent also oversees all that programming and make sure it's a priority with district strategy and with the school board. Is all that connectivity necessary? And it comes from clear delineation of roles and duties.
Thanks, Jill. We're gonna take a couple questions that came in from registrants before. This is from Johnson Community College. Ron, we'll direct this to you. What is the most pressing issue impacting school safety today? What is your number one priority that you're facing today?
It's a little bit of a loaded question because I think that school shootings have to be in the back of your mind, right? We just saw the report that was released, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where school shooting deaths have increased 500% in 53 years. So I think that that's important to keep in the back of your mind, but you should also keep in mind that that's actually 2.21 per 1 million. So it's really not, it's bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not, and it has to be in the back of your mind, but it's the everyday. It's the students that are fighting down on B Hall. It's the student in crisis mode because he's having a mental breakdown or she's having a mental breakdown. We have seen a crazy increase in disciplinary issues since COVID. COVID was horrible for the educational world. And we have to figure out how to figure that out and get back on track. And it's that mental health piece. And which a lot of states, a lot of districts are missing that. Right. So we forget about that mental health piece. So I think that the everyday is more what is our biggest focus while we still keep active aggressors in the back of our mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. One of my dear colleagues, Dr. Kevin Eberly, talks about the what if scenario. And if you think about it, you know, when I was teaching in a classroom, I taught English. If I heard something in the hallway, my immediate thought was that there was probably 2 kids in a fist fight. That's just where my mind went. There's probably 2 kids body on body doing some minimal damage to one another, and I got to get help or I got to get out there. Today, teachers, you know, in their locked classrooms, when they hear something in the hallway, most of them, their what if is, what if it's a school shooting? Where do I run to? Do I help these kids? Do I go out a window? Do I grab a pair of scissors to fight back? What a way to do your job. You know, and so I think it's really about helping our educators get back to teaching and learning again, helping our students get back to it too, right?
And that's the goal, Jill. I mean, that's the goal. I mean, because it's going to take time because, like Ron mentioned, I mean, you know, active shooter is very rare, but it is top of mind when it comes to students. It is the number one concern. We talk about mental health, talk about anxiety, feeling isolated. You know, social media. There's so many factors that we have today. And the threats are different today. I mean, back when I was in school, in high school, we had a fallout shelter in the basement. You know, the big threat was, you know, during the 80s was the Cold War and potential of a mushroom cloud. How do you react to that? Now, the chances of that obviously are very, very minimal, but you still need to put things in place to prepare for the worst case scenario. And hopefully we always talk about, you know, 1958, the last mass casualty with a school fire in Chicago. And, you know, can we say in 2028, that was the last year, remember back, that was a long time ago, that was the last time we had a casualty due to active violence in school. And so that's what we're working towards. We are out of time. So before I ask our guests just to share their final thoughts and words of wisdom with everybody, we did not get a chance to answer all the questions that came in. No surprise. And so if you go to the community after this, go to zeronow.org, click on community. You can, we'll post the questions that came in. It'll probably take about 15, 20 minutes, but you can continue to ask questions in there as well for Kelly, Ron, and Jill. So given that, Ron, we'll start with you. Just your final thoughts for our participants today.
I think your takeaway here should be communication and building relationships. Those are your 2 biggest things, and creating culture, right? When you have those 3 in place, then I think you're going to be better off. And then also know that it's not a one and done. So this is a journey. We're constantly evolving, right? So there's something that changes every other day when it comes to school security, and you have to be able to change with it. So get someone in place, get you a full-time security director, full-time safety director, and so that they can learn and guide you along the way.
Thanks, Ron. Appreciate that. Jill, final thoughts for our participants.
I don't know if it's the police wife in me or what, but just I really think those relationships with law enforcement are paramount. And I think, you know, proactively and making sure that there's familiarity between staff members, between building administration, not only district level, but building level teachers and staff. They recognize these folks, students know these folks coming in and out of their building, whether it's an SRO, or I know some districts don't have a dedicated SRO, but making sure that law enforcement is a regular part of the school processes and school operations is number one. And those relationships have to get started, you know, quickly.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Kelly, your final words of wisdom for our participants.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly echo both Ron and Jill, but just reemphasizing again that pivotal role of a multidisciplinary safety team and making sure that you have an effective leader in that role who's going to prioritize safety and security. You know, continue to push that envelope, make safety a core value in all of your endeavors. And, you know, start small if you have to, you know, wherever you're at in the process, start there, determine what it is that, you know, those first steps are and move from there. It is a journey, like Ron said. So, you know, I just really appreciate everybody's engagement today and for having us.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, Ron, and Jill. And just want to remind everyone that our next program is the next step down the path, which is assessing school safety vulnerabilities. What are your vulnerabilities? So once you have your team established, once you have that leader established to lead the journey, now let's understand where the gaps are. And that is on Tuesday, April 16th at 2 p.m. Right here. So just keep an eye on the ZeroNow website, or I'm sure you get the emails to learn about that. So with that, we'll see everyone back in the community to post your additional questions, and we'll respond to those answers. We'll respond to your questions. Thank you, Kelly, Jill, and Ron. I think we learned a lot today, and hopefully everyone is at a much better place understanding the bigger picture and the importance of having clear ownership for a safety team to guide that journey to safer schools. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care.